Winter passed slowly, but each day felt a little warmer than the one before. The snow began to shrink into thin ribbons along the fences, and the frozen creek started to sing again under the early spring sun. Ethan's ranch came alive with sound, the neighing of horses, the creak of the windmill, and the soft laughter that had been missing from it for years. Lila's laughter. She had changed since the night he found her. Her face, once pale and full of fear, now carried calmness and color. She still wore his coat when the mornings were cold, though he had told her many times she could take one of her own from the closet. She only smiled and said quietly, "This one makes me feel safe." The riders never came back. Maybe they realized Ethan wouldn't yield, or maybe the storm had taken them far from the valley. Either way, peace had returned. But even peace carried memories that sometimes hurt to touch. One morning, Ethan found Lila standing by the river, looking at her reflection in the slow-moving water. The trees nearby were budding, and a soft breeze played with her hair. She didn't notice him approach until he spoke. "You're quiet this morning." She turned and smiled faintly. "I was just thinking how strange it feels to be alive again." Ethan nodded. "You deserve to live, Lila. You survived more than most ever could." She looked down at the water. "Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see the faces of the people I lost. My father, my town, the ones who didn't make it out. I keep wondering why I did." He walked closer and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Because you were meant to. You kept going when the world turned dark. That means something." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "And you? You stayed kind. You could have turned away from me like everyone else, but you didn't." Ethan smiled softly. "I guess I was waiting for a reason to believe again." For a long moment they stood together by the river, saying nothing. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was peaceful, filled with understanding that didn't need words. As the days warmed, Lila began to do more around the ranch. She learned to ride again, though she still held the reins carefully, her hands unsure at first. Ethan taught her gently, patient as ever. "The horse feels your heart," he told her one afternoon. "If you're scared, he'll know. If you're calm, he'll follow." She nodded and took a slow breath. By the end of the week, she could ride across the open field, her laughter echoing through the valley like the first song of spring. Ethan would watch from the fence, smiling to himself, feeling the quiet pride of seeing her heal. One evening after they finished supper, Lila sat near the fire, mending a torn glove. Ethan was carving a small wooden figure, something he often did to pass the time. She looked at him and said softly, "You never told me why you live out here alone." Ethan set the carving knife down and stared into the flames. "After the war ended, I came home to nothing. The town was gone. The people I knew were gone. I thought I could outrun the memories by working the land, but the quiet just made them louder. So I stayed here, away from everything." Lila's eyes softened. "I know that feeling. When you lose everyone, you start thinking maybe you're not meant to belong anywhere." He looked at her. "You belong here now." She blinked, surprised by the words. "Do you mean that?" He nodded. "I do." That night, when she went to her small room, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "Good night, Ethan," she said gently. "Good night, Lila," he replied. After she left, he sat by the fire a long time, staring at the empty chair she had just left. He hadn't realized until that moment how much life she had brought back into the house, how her quiet presence had filled the emptiness he'd carried for so long. Days turned into weeks. Flowers began to bloom across the meadows. Lila helped plant the early vegetables, laughing when her hands got covered in dirt. Ethan teased her that she was better at riding than farming, and she threw a handful of soil at him with a grin. For the first time in years, laughter echoed around the ranch again. One afternoon, she found the same coat he'd given her that night folded neatly on the chair. She picked it up and walked to where Ethan was fixing the fence. "I think it's yours again," she said with a soft smile. He looked at her, shaking his head. "Keep it. It suits you better." She smiled wider. "You always say that." "It's true," he said. She hesitated, holding the coat close to her chest. "Ethan, if you hadn't found me that night." He stopped her with a gentle look. "Don't think about what might have happened. Think about what did." Her eyes filled with tears. "You saved me." He shook his head. "No, Lila, you saved yourself. I just happened to be there." But deep down, both knew it wasn't that simple. She had been moments away from death that night, and his voice, the first kind voice she had heard in years, had pulled her back into life. Later that evening, as the sky turned pink and gold, they sat on the porch together, watching the horizon. The land stretched far and quiet before them, dotted with the first green patches of spring. Lila spoke softly. "Do you ever wonder why people cross our paths at the right time?" Ethan thought for a moment. Maybe it's not by chance. Maybe it's the world's way of giving us another chance to fix what was broken. She nodded, looking at him with eyes that shone in the fading light. Then maybe that's what we're doing, fixing what was broken. He smiled. I'd like to believe that. A light breeze passed through, carrying the scent of wildflowers. For a while they sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The past had taken so much from them both, but here, in this quiet place, they had found something worth keeping. Peace, hope, and maybe something more. As night came, the stars began to appear one by one over the dark blue sky. Lila leaned back, wrapping herself in the coat. "It's strange," she whispered, "how something that once felt like the end can become a beginning." Ethan looked at her and said softly, "Sometimes that's how life works." She turned to him and smiled, a real bright smile that reached her eyes. "I think I'm finally home." He nodded, his heart full. "You are." The fire inside the cabin glowed through the window, casting warm light across the porch. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, but the sound didn't feel lonely. It felt alive, like the land itself was breathing again. Lila rested her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes. Ethan didn't move. He just sat there, feeling the peace of that moment, the kind he thought he'd never feel again. The winter storm had brought her to his door, half frozen and afraid. Now the same world that once tried to take everything from them had given something back, the simple, quiet gift of finding each other. As the stars filled the sky above the ranch, Ethan whispered quietly, almost to himself, "You'll never freeze out here again." And for the first time in years, both believed it. The next few days passed quietly, filled with the simple rhythm of ranch life. The snow began to melt a little, and the cold winds softened into calmer air. Lila grew stronger each morning. Her cheeks gained color, and she began to help Ethan with small chores, fetching water, brushing the horse, and cooking meals. Though she moved carefully, her hands no longer trembled the way they once did. Sometimes, Ethan would catch her smiling faintly while watching the firelight dance on the walls, and it made his heart feel lighter than it had in years. Ethan didn't talk much about what had happened before, and Lila didn't ask. There was peace in silence, a comfort in knowing someone was near but not prying into your pain. Still deep inside, both knew the world outside wasn't finished with them yet. Lila had run too far from too many people for her troubles to disappear easily. One afternoon, while they were fixing the barn roof together, Lila suddenly froze and looked toward the distant hills. Her face went pale. Ethan followed her gaze but saw nothing except the wide white land and the slow drifting of clouds. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated. "I thought I saw riders." He frowned and shaded his eyes. There was no clear movement, just the faint shimmer of light on the horizon. "Probably just sunlight on the ice," he said. "You're safe here, Lila." She nodded but didn't look convinced. That night she barely ate, and when the wind howled outside she jumped at every sound. Ethan tried to reassure her, but she only said softly, "They don't give up easy." The next morning, when Ethan stepped outside to check the horses, he found hoof prints near the far fence line, not his own. Fresh, leading from the road and looping around the pasture, he crouched, pressing a hand into the snow. They were from at least 3 horses, maybe 4. He went back inside quietly, not wanting to startle Lila. She was by the fire, warming her hands. "You were right," he said gently. "There were riders nearby last night." Her eyes widened in fear. "Then they found me." Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. They were looking, but they didn't come close enough to see the cabin. We'll be careful." "What if they come back?" she whispered. "Then I'll handle it," he said firmly. She stared at him, uncertain. "You shouldn't get involved, Ethan. They're dangerous men." "They hurt anyone who helps me." He smiled faintly. "Then they'll find out I don't scare easy." That evening, Ethan set extra wood near the fire and checked his rifle by the door. He didn't want trouble, but he wasn't about to let her be taken again. Lila tried to stay calm, but her eyes darted toward the windows whenever the wind shifted. When night fell, the dogs began barking. Ethan moved to the window and saw a faint lantern light moving through the darkness. His jaw tightened. "They're here." Lila stood frozen, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "Please," she whispered. "Don't let them in." "I won't," Ethan said. He blew out the lamp so only the fire lit the room, then motioned for her to stay behind the wall. Outside, voices called through the cold air. "Anyone home?" One man shouted. "We're looking for a woman. Small, wrapped in cloth. Ran off a few days back. Might have come this way." Ethan stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting in his arms but pointed down. "Haven't seen anyone," he said calmly. "Just me here." The men rode closer, their faces half hidden by scarves. One dismounted and squinted at him. "Storm's rough country to be alone in. You sure no one came by?" "Pretty sure," Ethan replied. "No tracks but my own." The man looked around, then back at him. "Mind if we check your barn?" Ethan met his eyes. "I do mind. Don't take kindly to strangers poking around without reason." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Didn't mean trouble. Just asking." He climbed back onto his horse, glancing once more at the cabin windows. "If you see anyone, you'd better tell us. She's a thief. Dangerous, too." Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. "You'll be the first to know," he said flatly. When they finally rode off into the darkness, Ethan waited until their lights disappeared before going back inside. Lila was standing by the fire, trembling. "They said I was dangerous," she said bitterly. "That's what they told everyone, so no one would help me." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "They won't come back tonight. You can rest easy." But neither of them truly slept. Ethan kept watch by the window until morning, listening for hoofbeats. Lila sat quietly near the fire, staring into the flames as if seeing the ghosts of her past in their flicker. By dawn, the riders were gone, leaving only deep tracks in the snow that led back toward the hills. Still, Ethan knew they might return. Later that day, while fixing the door hinge, he said gently, "You could stay here as long as you want, Lila. You don't have to go back out there. No one will find you if you don't want to be found." She hesitated, her eyes shining with uncertainty. "You've already risked enough for me. If they find out I'm here, they'll burn this place like they did before." "They'll have to get past me first," Ethan said simply. Lila looked at him for a long time, then smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn." "Guess I haven't changed much," he said with a soft laugh. The tension between them eased a little after that, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. She helped him in the barn, brushing down the horses while he fixed a broken wheel. The simple work seemed to calm her. For a while, it almost felt like the world outside had forgotten them. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she brought him a bowl of stew. He thanked her and said, "You make this place feel like a home again." She smiled quietly. "It's been a long time since I felt safe anywhere." Ethan looked at her across the table. "You're safe now. I promise." When night came, the cabin felt warm and peaceful. The dogs lay sleeping near the door. Lila sat sewing near the fire while Ethan read an old book by lamplight. Every so often she would glance at him with a soft, grateful expression. But outside, hidden by the darkness, faint shadows moved among the trees. The riders had returned, their lanterns dimmed this time. One of them pointed toward the cabin, whispering something. Inside, Ethan suddenly felt the horse stir in the stable. His instincts flared. He set down the book and reached for the rifle. Lila noticed and froze. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay here," he said. He stepped quietly to the door and looked out through the crack. 3 shapes were moving closer through the snow. One held a torch. Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't want violence, but he wouldn't let them take her. He stepped outside, voice steady. "You men didn't learn last night?" They stopped, startled. The man in front sneered. "You're hiding her." "We tracked her prints right here. Hand her over and no one gets hurt. Turn around and leave," Ethan said coldly. "Last warning." The man lifted his torch higher. "She's worth money, friend." "Don't be foolish," Ethan raised his rifle. "I said leave." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the man hesitated, looked at the others, and slowly lowered his torch. "You'll regret this," he muttered before turning away. Ethan watched until their shapes vanished back into the dark. Then he went inside and bolted the door. Lila ran to him, eyes full of fear. "You could have been killed." He smiled gently. "I've faced worse storms." Tears filled her eyes. "Why are you doing this for me?" "Because no one did it for you before," he said quietly. "And because I should have found you years ago." Lila didn't speak. She just stepped forward and hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his shirt. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of fear lift from her heart. Ethan held her close, knowing that whatever came next, he would face it beside her. Outside, the cold night settled again, but inside the cabin there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the small, fragile hope that maybe, after everything they had lost, they had finally found something worth holding on to. The next morning, the sun rose behind a thin layer of clouds, painting the sky a dull silver. Ethan was already outside, mending a broken fence post when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned and saw the woman standing near the gate, wrapped in his old coat, the wind brushing her hair across her face. For the first time since that snowy night, he noticed how much strength had returned to her movements. She didn't tremble anymore, though her eyes still carried the shadow of something she had lived through. "Morning," Ethan said, leaning on his shovel. "You slept better last night, I hope." She nodded. "Yes, I dreamed of sunlight." "That's a good dream to have after all that snow," he said with a smile. "You can call me Ethan, by the way. Might make things easier." Her eyes flickered up toward him. "Ethan," she repeated softly, as if testing how it sounded. Then she turned slightly away. "Thank you for letting me stay. I'll leave once I'm strong enough." "No need to rush," he said. "You can stay as long as you like." He meant it kindly, but she tensed a little, as if unsure how to take kindness anymore. She pulled the cloth closer to her face and murmured, "You don't even know who I am." Ethan hesitated. He wanted to tell her that he did know, or at least suspected, but he didn't want to frighten her. So he said quietly, "Maybe not, but I know you needed help. That's enough for me." She said nothing more, but something in her shoulders eased slightly. She stayed near him that morning, watching him repair the fence. Every now and then, she would point out where the boards were loose or fetch nails for him. It was small help, but he noticed she seemed calmer when she had something to do. By midday, they returned to the cabin. The sky darkened again, though it wasn't snow this time, just wind sweeping across the open plain. Ethan stirred soup over the fire while she sat near the window, watching the world move beyond the glass. After a while, she spoke again, her voice quiet. "You're not like the others." "What others?" Ethan asked. "Men who offer kindness and expect something in return," she said, not looking at him. "The ones who pretend to help, then turn cruel when you have nowhere else to go." Ethan froze with the ladle in his hand. He set it down slowly. "You've met too many people like that, haven't you?" Her silence was the only answer he needed. Then she whispered, "That's why I ran. That's why I hid in the storm." He turned to her. "Who were you running from?" She hesitated. "Men from the hills. They took me from a camp near Cedar Creek. I was kept there until I found a way to escape." Ethan's heart stopped for a moment. Cedar Creek, the same town that had burned down years ago. The same place where he'd last seen Lila Harper before the raid. He took a deep breath. "When was this?" "Years ago," she said, her eyes distant. "I don't remember how long. Days turned into months, months into winters. I stopped counting." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "One night, a fight broke out between them. I slipped away in the dark and kept walking. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving. When the snow started, I thought maybe that was the end for me. But then I saw the light from your cabin." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wanted to tell her who he thought she was, but the words stuck. What if he was wrong? What if saying it only made her pain worse? "Do you remember your name?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, startled by the question. For a moment, her eyes searched his face as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Then she whispered, "Lila." Ethan's hands went numb. The sound of that name hit him harder than any storm ever could. She noticed his reaction and frowned slightly. "You look like you've heard it before." He swallowed hard. "I have." Lila stared at him, confused. "Where?" He stepped closer, his voice low and careful. "Cedar Creek, before the fire. Your father ran the general store. You used to hum when you stocked the shelves. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face. How do you know that? Because I was there, he said quietly. I worked on a ranch outside town. I used to stop by for supplies. We talked a few times. You gave me my first coin pouch, remember? You said it was good luck. Lila covered her mouth with shaking hands. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't speak. I thought you were gone. Ethan continued softly. Everyone said the Harpers didn't make it out when the raiders came. I looked for you after the smoke cleared, but there was nothing left. She sank into the chair, her body trembling. For a long time she couldn't speak. Then she whispered, I wanted to believe someone would come, but no one did. I thought everyone had forgotten. Never, Ethan said firmly. I never forgot. The silence that followed was heavy with years of grief neither had spoken of before. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind carried faint sounds through the valley. Finally, Lila lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. When they took me that night, I tried to fight, but there were too many. I waited for death every day after that. But then something kept me alive. A memory of a boy who always smiled when I gave him supplies. He said he'd come back one day. I told myself that if I lived, maybe I'd see him again. Ethan's throat tightened. Lila, you did see him again. She stared at him for a long time, as if trying to believe her own eyes. Then slowly, she reached up and pulled the cloth from her face. Her cheeks were marked with faint scars and her skin was pale, but her eyes were still the same, warm and deep as he remembered. Ethan felt tears blur his vision. It's really you, he whispered. Lila tried to smile through her tears. And you're still the same, always trying to fix what's broken. He laughed softly, though it was shaky. You weren't broken, just lost for a while. She looked down, then nodded. I guess I was. For the rest of the evening they spoke quietly, sharing memories that had nearly been buried by time. Lila told him how she had escaped, how she wandered from one town to another under different names, always hiding, always afraid. Ethan listened without interrupting, his heart heavy but full of gratitude that she was alive. When she grew tired, he said gently, You don't have to run anymore. Not from anyone. Lila looked at him across the fire. Do you really think I can start again? He nodded. I know you can. The past can't chase you here. Her eyes softened. Then maybe I'll stay. For a while. Ethan smiled, and for the first time in years something warm filled the silence between them, a quiet understanding stronger than words. Outside, the wind eased and the stars began to show through the clouds. Ethan added one more log to the fire and looked at her, thinking how strange fate was. He had spent years alone, haunted by memories of the girl who vanished in the flames. And now, without warning, she had walked back into his life through a snowstorm. That night, as she slept peacefully for the first time in years, Ethan sat near the window, watching the moonlight fall across the land. The storm had ended, but he knew another one was coming, not of wind or snow, but of the past trying to find them again. He promised himself he wouldn't let her be taken a second time. The storm outside had stopped, but the world was still covered in white silence. Ethan stepped out early to check the fences and bring in firewood before the sun rose high. The cold bit his face, but his thoughts were somewhere else, back in the cabin with the woman sleeping near his fire. He didn't even know her name, yet he couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about the sound of her voice and the way she held herself made a quiet echo in his memory. When he came back inside, she was awake, sitting on the floor near the fire with his coat still wrapped around her. She was staring into the flames, her face hidden beneath that same cloth. Ethan tried to speak softly so he wouldn't scare her. Morning. How you feeling? She jumped slightly at the sound of his voice, then nodded. Warmer. Thank you. Her words were polite, but there was something distant in them. The voice of someone who had learned to be careful with every sentence. Ethan poured her a cup of tea and placed it in her hands. You can rest here as long as you need, he said. No one's going to bother you. She looked at him for the first time, and though most of her face was covered, he could see her eyes, brown with flecks of gold near the center, eyes that looked both young and very old at the same time. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked quietly. Ethan paused, surprised by the question. "Because it's right," he said simply. "I couldn't just leave you out there." She nodded, lowering her gaze. "Most men don't stop." Ethan didn't answer. He went to stir the stew on the stove, but his mind was full of questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why did she sound like someone from his past? Someone whose memory still visited him on lonely nights. After breakfast, she tried to stand, but her legs gave way beneath her. Ethan caught her before she fell. She looked embarrassed and whispered, "I'll get stronger soon." "You don't have to rush," he said. "You just survived a storm. Take your time." As he helped her back to the chair, her hand brushed against his and he felt how cold her fingers still were. For a brief moment, she looked at him as if she wanted to say something. But then she turned away again, all day. Ethan worked around the cabin, chopping wood, feeding the horse, and clearing snow from the door. Every time he came inside, she would thank him for something. The water, the blanket, the fire. Her voice carried a strange calmness, as if she'd been through storms far worse than the one outside. By evening, Ethan sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, while she sat quietly across from him. The room was small, lit only by the fire's glow. After a long silence, she said softly, "You live alone here?" He nodded. "Been that way a while. Why?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Lost most folks during the war. Some didn't come back. Some just never wrote again. Guess I got used to the quiet." She looked into the flames. "Quiet can be heavy." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes." The way she said it made him think she knew exactly what that kind of silence felt like. He wanted to ask where she came from, who she'd lost, but something told him not to push her. Instead, he poured her another cup of tea and said, "You can tell me anything when you're ready." That night she slept again by the fire. The wind had picked up just enough to whistle through the window frames. Ethan lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling. The woman's words repeated in his head. Most men don't stop. What had happened to her? Who had hurt her so deeply that even kindness felt strange? He turned on his side, watching the flickering light fall across her face. The cloth she wore had slipped slightly, revealing part of her cheek and jaw. The sight stirred something sharp and distant in him. He had seen that face before, years ago when he was younger and the world hadn't yet turned cold. Her name had been Lila Harper. She'd lived near the old town of Cedar Creek, the daughter of a kind man who ran the general store. She used to laugh in the sunlight, helping her father stack supplies. Ethan remembered riding past their porch one afternoon, watching her wave with a smile bright enough to make him forget where he was going. That was before the raid and before everything burned. Everyone said she'd died that night, taken or lost in the chaos. He'd carried that guilt for years. But the more he looked at the woman sleeping near his fire, the more that memory refused to stay buried. Morning came slow and bright. He woke to find her already awake, folding the blanket neatly. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's good to be useful," she replied softly. He smiled. "Well, if you're up to it, there's breakfast on the stove." She smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd seen on her face. For a moment, she looked almost peaceful, but when she noticed his gaze, she turned away, pulling the cloth higher. The days passed quietly. She began helping with small chores, washing dishes, feeding the horse, sweeping the floor. Her movements were careful, graceful even, but he could tell she was still recovering. Every so often, she would glance out the window toward the distant hills with a look of worry, as if expecting someone to appear. One evening, while Ethan was repairing a harness, she sat near the fire humming softly. The sound froze him. It was a melody he hadn't heard in years, an old song Lila used to hum while waiting for her father to finish counting supplies at the store. He set the harness down and listened. When she noticed him staring, she stopped suddenly, her hands trembling. "Where did you learn that tune?" he asked quietly. Her voice wavered. "I don't remember. It just came back to me." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "I used to know someone who sang it." She looked down, saying nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, staring at her as she slept. He didn't want to believe it, couldn't. But deep down, every sign pointed to the same truth. The way she spoke, the tone of her voice, the scar he'd glimpsed near her wrist when she reached for the kettle, everything matched the memory of Lila Harper. The next morning, he found her outside, standing near the fence where he'd first discovered her. She was looking toward the woods, lost in thought. "You should stay close to the fire," he called out. "It's colder today." She turned, startled, then smiled weakly. "I was just remembering something." "Good memories, I hope," he said gently. "Some," she whispered. "Some I wish I could forget." He stepped closer. "You don't have to run anymore, you know. Whoever hurt you, they're not here." Her eyes glistened, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But she only nodded and turned back toward the cabin. As she walked, the wind caught her cloth and lifted it slightly. For a second, Ethan saw her face clearly in the daylight, pale, tired, and beautiful in a way that stirred every hidden memory he'd buried. It was her. It had to be. But before he could speak, she pulled the cloth back up, unaware of what he had seen. Ethan stood frozen, the cold air forgotten. The girl he had mourned years ago was alive, standing in front of him, breathing, hiding behind a piece of cloth. As he watched her return to the cabin, one thought filled his mind. Fate had a strange way of bringing the past back, sometimes through storms, sometimes through silence. And now, as he stepped after her, Ethan knew the truth would soon come out, no matter how long she tried to hide it. The wind howled across the open plains, carrying thin flakes of snow that stung the skin like needles. Ethan Ward tightened the scarf around his neck and guided his horse along the frozen trail. The storm had rolled in faster than anyone expected. Night was falling, and the sky was turning the color of cold iron. He needed to get home before the road vanished under the drifts. His horse snorted, sensing the bitter air and the weight of the snow pressing in from every side. Ethan leaned low against the saddle, eyes squinting through the white curtain. He knew this land better than anyone within 50 miles, but tonight, everything looked strange. Hills melted into shadows, fences disappeared under snowbanks, and even the old pine at the ridge seemed like a ghostly figure in the dark. He thought of the fire waiting in his cabin, of the stew he had left warming on the stove. But before he could picture the comfort of home, something else caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a broken post lying across the trail. Then the shape moved. Ethan pulled on the reins, bringing his horse to a halt. He leaned forward, trying to see. Through the blowing snow, he saw a small mound near the fence line, something wrapped in dark cloth shaking. A part of him wanted to ride on. It was freezing, and stopping too long could cost him dearly. But then a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, weak cry that didn't belong to the wind. He climbed down from the saddle, boots sinking into the snow. The cold bit through his coat, but he ignored it. As he stepped closer, he realized the figure wasn't just trembling. It was a person. A woman curled up against the post, covered in snow. Her hands were bare and blue from the cold, clutching at the torn edge of a blanket that barely covered her shoulders. She didn't even look up as he approached. She just whispered something he couldn't hear. "Ma'am," he said, kneeling beside her, "you'll freeze out here." The woman flinched at his voice as if she expected him to strike her. Ethan saw her try to pull away, but she was too weak. He removed his gloves and gently brushed the snow from her face. She wore a thin cloth that covered her head and part of her face, tied tight like a veil. He could only see the edge of her cheek, pale and frostbitten. "Hey," he said softly. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved. "Please." "Don't send me back," Ethan frowned. "Back where?" She didn't answer. Her voice was barely more than a breath. He looked around, no wagon tracks, no footprints but his own. Whoever she was, she'd been here alone for hours, maybe since morning. The storm must have trapped her out here. He looked at his horse, then back at her. "I can't leave you," he said. He slipped his heavy coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around her shaking form. Her body was cold as ice, and when he lifted her, she didn't resist. She weighed almost nothing. Ethan carried her to the horse and mounted carefully, keeping her close to his chest to share what warmth he could. Her head rested weakly against his shoulder. Every so often, he'd feel her breathing slow and tighten his grip, murmuring, "Stay awake, ma'am. We're almost home." The ride back felt longer than any he'd made before. Snow thickened, turning the world into a blur of white. Ethan guided the horse by memory, trusting the animal to find the way. He could feel the woman's faint heartbeat against his chest, weak but steady. He prayed it wouldn't stop before they reached the cabin. Finally, the shadow of his small ranch appeared, a single cabin with smoke barely rising from the chimney. Relief washed over him. He dismounted and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The warmth from the fire hit them both, though it wasn't enough to chase away the chill that clung to her skin. Ethan laid her on the couch near the hearth. He threw more logs into the fire until it roared to life, lighting the room in shades of orange and gold. Then he poured hot water into a basin and soaked a cloth to warm her hands and face. She didn't open her eyes. "Come on now," he said, rubbing her fingers gently. "You made it. You're safe." After a few minutes, her breathing steadied. She opened her eyes just a little, and he saw a flicker of fear mixed with confusion. "Where am I?" she whispered. "My ranch," he replied. "You were out by the fence. Snow near buried you. What were you doing out there?" She stared at the fire instead of answering. He saw her lips tremble, not just from cold. She looked lost, like someone who had run so far she forgot why she ran. "You don't have to talk now," he said softly. "Rest, you're safe here." He brought her a bowl of broth and helped her sip a few drops. Her hands shook as she held the spoon and he steadied it for her. She mumbled a thank you, though her voice was so quiet he barely heard it. When she finally fell asleep, Ethan sat by the fire, staring at her. Something about her felt familiar. Maybe it was the shape of her hands or the way she breathed or the sound of her voice, but he couldn't place it. The storm outside raged through the night. Snow piled high against the windows. Ethan checked on her every hour, afraid she'd fade away in her sleep. Each time she stirred a little, whispering things he didn't understand, names maybe or places from another life. By dawn, the wind had quieted. Pale light filtered through the frost on the window. The woman was still asleep, her face hidden beneath the cloth. Ethan rose and made breakfast, his thoughts tangled. He wanted to know who she was, but he didn't want to frighten her by asking too much. When she woke, he handed her a cup of tea. "You feeling better?" She nodded faintly, still not meeting his eyes. "Thank you for not leaving me." Ethan smiled gently. "Couldn't do that. No one deserves to die in the cold." For a long moment, silence filled the cabin. The fire crackled and snow slid off the roof in soft thuds. Then she spoke again, her tone uncertain. "Do you live alone?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Been that way since the war. Just me and the land." She lowered her gaze. "You're kind. Most men would have kept riding," he shrugged. "Maybe I'm just stubborn." A faint smile touched her lips, though it vanished quickly. She clutched the cloth tighter around her face, as if hiding something she didn't want him to see. Ethan tried not to stare, but curiosity burned inside him. He spent the day tending to chores, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman resting inside. When he returned to the cabin in the evening, he found her sitting near the window, looking out at the snow. The fading light touched her hair, and for a moment he thought he recognized that color, deep brown with a hint of gold. But when she noticed him watching, she turned away. Ethan smiled to ease her nerves. "You're welcome to stay till the weather clears," he said. "I've got plenty of room." "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice trembled slightly, and he could see tears glinting in her eyes. That night, as he sat near the fire, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought her to his door. He didn't know her story yet or why she'd been out there in the storm, but deep inside something told him this was no ordinary meeting. The way she spoke, the look in her eyes, even her silence, it all carried the weight of something long lost, something hidden beneath years of pain and distance. He looked at her one last time before blowing out the lamp. She slept soundly now, her breathing soft and even. The cloth still covered her face. But Ethan knew without understanding why that when that cloth finally fell, his whole past might come rushing back with it.